make this more awkward.
We're good.
Okay, well, so I'm Justin Mammen. Do I talk into that thing? I feel weird.
No, just talk loud.
Okay.
You can talk to
So I guess, yeah, you guys are talking about missions. I think Skid Row definitely is a mission field. And I think I'll just kind of talk about my experience, what brought me initially to Skid Row. I grew up in Laverne, California, which is, if you think of suburbia, it is suburbia. It's the epitome of American suburbias. Everybody who's a firefighter owned an SUV. It's a white picket fence. So I had no interaction with homeless folks growing up. And then I went to UCLA, got involved in InterVarsity, to think a little bit more about life outside of my little sphere. And the way I actually ended up in St. Vincent's was interesting. I graduated college, and I think in my background, my culture, Indian background, it's very much you need to move on to higher education. You can't just have a bachelor's. That's disgraceful. You have to be something beyond the bachelor's. And I knew I wanted to help people, so I was like, well, what can I do? So I ended up going to social work school because I didn't know what else to do. And the way social work school works out is you have to do 2 years of field practicum. And so my first year, they told me I was going to be at St. Vincent's. So I originally thought I was at St. Vincent's Hospital. I was like, okay, this will be cool. I get a nice little pager, a nice little office, I'll be a medical social worker. And then they told me I was going to be at St. Vincent's Cardinal Manning Center. I was like, what the heck is that? Cardinal Manning Center? This doesn't make any sense. And so eventually I found out I was on Skid Row, and I was not happy. Because growing up in LA, I knew about Skid Row. Skid Row was the place we didn't go to. Like, it was a ministry site. It was a site where I'd go with church, or when I was in Ivy. Oh, you go out and you pass sandwiches there, and you pass out food, and it was a way of, as someone going to school in Westwood, it was a way of getting out of your comfort zone for a good hour or two to have that experience of working with the poor. Which it's good in a sense. It's getting yourself out of the comfort zone. But that's all I knew. Making it like, okay, then your job is now to work in Skid Row, I was not too pleased with. So I went to school, and I actually started working in Skid Row at St. Vincent's Cardinal Manning Center, the shelter I currently work at right now. And it was tricky. I think I was working in the transitional program for men, and it was very interesting. I think one of the things that kind of shocked me was growing up in a suburban neighborhood versus my clients, because I worked in the men's program, was just how different my background was versus their background. Like, one of the things that always bothered me was we had a couple clients in the program, and their parents would come visit them, and they would bring them food and bring them goodies and stuff like that. So they had family who were housed, living in different parts of LA, but they would visit their sons in the shelter, and they would give them food. And it just kind of struck me, because I was coming from like my background. Like, if I ever fell upon hard times, like if I lost my job or lost my house, we would go live with our folks. Yeah. So, so that was like, I have that social support structure. And I think that what really it was a culture shock for me, was realizing, oh my gosh, people don't have those support structures, or their family they're not doing so hot that if their son were to come live with them, they would be evicted. Like, they can't just have people over, like, because they don't own the houses, they're renting, and they're just getting by. So it was a huge culture shock for me. And so I think that was, for me, coming from an suburban neighborhood, learning about urban issues and street life, it was a rough transition. Because some things just made sense. I'm like, well, if you have problems, call your mom, and mom will give you some money. Isn't that just how things get done? Or is it, like, people just, that's how it is. Like, if you have problems, you go see your family. Or, you have kids, so how often do you see your kids? You must see them every weekend, right? Or you try to see them. Like, no, I haven't seen my kids in 15, 20 years. Like, I've attempted to make contact with them. No. And then actually getting to work more with people and realizing, there's a reason behind why folks aren't meeting with people. Either they aren't allowed to see their family anymore, or they've burned so many bridges that they're not allowed to come back. I'll never forget, one guy said, he told a group of students who were visiting, we have a panel discussion on homelessness, and one of my panelists was a resident in our facility said, there's only so many times you can steal from your mama before your mama says, get the hell out and don't ever come back. And it was kind of like he was stuck in his addiction, and what he would do is he would stay at his mom's house, he would steal stuff from his mom and sell it and use it to get drugs, and kind of fed this bad cycles to his point that his mom said, get out. And that was just kind of a huge, like, what? You would steal from your mom? Like, that just seems kind of weird to me. So it was definitely a hard transition. So I did grad school there, and I really enjoyed it. I actually was thinking about leaving the program, but what kept me in because the schoolwork for social work was kind of not that great. I didn't think the academics were that challenging. So I decided to, I'm going to come back and just focus on my internship. And I stayed with the internship. I ended up staying with the program. And at St. Vincent's is actually what kept me in my social work program. If it wasn't for that, I think I would have dropped out of the social work program and done something else. And so after I graduated, I worked some other places. And then I came back to St. Vincent's. I came back as a social worker there. And I ran their family shelter program. And then I've been there since 2005. Did some stuff at Santa Monica College for a little bit, working with at-risk students, and kind of worked in different realms as a social worker, family shelter coordinator, and now I'm the deputy director of their shelter program. So I've had different roles within the organization. So I guess you want me to talk a little bit about St. Vincent de Paul, what we do, kind of our philosophy? Okay. Well, St. Vincent de Paul, it's an interesting organization, and I like to say it's a faith-based organization, but it's a little bit different than most other faith-based organizations. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a very old organization in the sense that it was founded actually in 1830 by a college student in France. It was Frederick Osnam, and he was a college student, so probably less than our ages. I used to say my age, but it doesn't really work anymore. So he was a college student who was inspired by the work of St. Vincent de Paul, who was in the late 1600s or 1700s. St. Vincent de Paul was a man who helped the poor in France, and it was all about living with the poor and helping the poor, basically the Mother Teresa of his day. And he was inspired by that, and he actually started what was kind of called, I guess what modern day would be like a home church. He got people together, and they talked about God, and they talked about politics. They talked about God and everything but politics. They talked about social justice issues and everything, but they were not allowed to talk about politics. It was an interesting concept, and it came out to be called a conferencia, so a conference. And so the heart of it was people gathering together to talk about spirituality and to talk about social justice and to help others. So this college student formed these basically conferencias, and it kind of grew, and it expanded. And so now St. Vincent de Paul is all over the world. They do a lot of stuff internationally and nationally. I'm part of St. Vincent de Paul of Los Angeles, which was actually started in 1908. Yes, 1908. So we've been around for over 100 years. We're one of the older nonprofits that are in Los Angeles. We cover LA, Ventura, and Santa Barbara counties. And we're faith-based. I think we're inspired by the teachings of Christ, but what makes us a little bit different than most other faith-based organizations is we don't necessarily evangelize. We don't, I always get this word wrong, proselytize. Yes, that's it. Okay, so we don't do that. I think the foundings of what we do is, they'll know we're Christians by our love. We show Christ's love through our actions. So that's the agency's kind of philosophy of working with people, is loving people through actions and being Christ for them. How can you be Christ for them without necessarily preaching to them? That's been a big value for our shelter in particular, being one of the only faith-based agencies on Skid Row that doesn't evangelize, which makes us a little bit different than some of the other faith-based shelters. So St. Vincent de Paul, we cover LA, Ventura, Santa Barbara County. We have thrift stores. That kind of helps fund the agency. We have the conferencias, which basically comes out to conferences. And we have about 100 conferences. And it's a weird word because they're basically social justice groups that work around the counties. They usually meet at churches, and it's a group of people who say, we want to help the folks in our community. So they form what's called a conference. And they do social service. They do rental assistance. They do utility assistance. They do food pantries. We're getting into foreclosure assistance now, so we're kind of moving and blending into that area of housing. So that's what the conferences do. We kind of help people in their community. We do a lot of referrals to our thrift store. So folks who need help with like furnishings and stuff like that, they get just free stuff from our thrift store through a referral from our conferences. We have a kids camp up in Santa Barbara, the Circle V, for kids who can't afford to go to camp. And then we have the shelters division. So St. Vincent Cardinal Manning Center is our main shelter that's on Skid Row. We're small, and we like being small. We're probably the smallest shelter on Skid Row. We only house about 85 people. We are a shelter still. It started in 1955. Actually, it was an old dairy processing plant. It was never meant to be a homeless shelter. And then we got one of those cool leases from the government, which basically they gave us the building. It says, as long as you keep it a shelter, you guys own the building and never have to pay off the bill. So it's kind of nice. So we have a couple programs. We have the emergency shelter program. We have for single men. We have a transitional program for men who are working, and we have a family shelter program. We also have a day center. A day center is basically our first floor where anyone can come in. They can shower. They can use the restrooms. We do transportation assistance. We do case management. So folks who want case management, we can help them out with that. We try to do new things. We're doing movie therapy groups. We try new kind of ways of doing some art stuff, like the smoking cessation group. We're going to be starting doing some of that in our down in our first floor drop-in center. We also have a computer lab that we just incorporated over the past year. So it's open to anybody, but our drop-in center, then our 3 residential programs. So that's kind of who we are, St. Vincent's Cardinal Manning Center. We're small. We're social work based. So we kind of really, and this kind of goes with the reason I work there. It's not, we're moving the agency away from charity to change. And I think our role as social workers, my boss, she's a social worker, and it's very much, we're founded on social work principles, is to work with people to get them out of the situation that they're in. Not on a charity level, but working on their systemic change level, to work on their underlying behaviors, to work on their access to jobs, access to education, and really kind of work with them to get them out of poverty and homelessness. I'm trying to think of things. I think, yeah, that's kind of our agency and what we do. Our philosophy is very much focusing on people and working on people. That's why we keep our numbers low at St. Vincent's, because it gives us a chance to get to know people. Like the folks who come to our shelter each night, our guys pretty much know them by first names. We don't bunk beds, which is a little bit different than some other agencies. We're also the only shelter in Skid Row that doesn't have a security department. And ironically, I like to say this because people have told me this, we're known as being the safest shelter on Skid Row. Mainly because we don't crowd people, I think, and we don't have that security presence. I think sometimes the security presence almost creates a prison environment for our folks. We have a lot of folks who are formerly in prison and incarcerated, and it creates a negative atmosphere. We have problems, and those do occur, and we train our staff to respond accordingly. But generally, we've been seen on Skid Row as kind of the safer shelter, but we're also known as the loosey-goosey shelter. We're flexible with people on the rules. We're a harm reduction facility, so no one's allowed to use any kind of drugs on the site or alcohol on site. But if someone comes in high or stoned, they're allowed to come in as long as they can respect themselves and respect others. We let them come in. It's kind of very much the social work principle, working where they're at and kind of working on them to get them out of sobriety, not necessarily the 12-step method. So we're a little bit loose. And one of the reasons we can be loose is because we are privately funded. Our agency overall is about 95% private funds, foundations and grants and endowments. It's only 5% of our entire agency is through government grants. So it gives us a lot more freedom to kind of change policies, change programs. And that's one of the reasons I work there in particular, is there's a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of creativity. Let's try this out and let's just see if it works. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, we'll try something new. We're not held to a 5-year grant that says you must do it this way. You're going to give your report to county DMH and they're going to review it and then they're going to audit you. There's a lot more